World War I, waves of young soldiers walking forward into a storm of steel. Generals, a set of blundering fools, sat safely behind the lines, drinking champagne.
Captain Darling and I are behind you.
About 35 miles behind.
These are the stories that we grew up with, that are still shown in the popular media as fact.
So what idiot gave the order to go over the top?
But what if all of this is wrong? What if I could explain to you today that the British and Empire armies of the First World War were actually dynamic and forward-thinking institutions, quick to embrace new technology and always ready to change tactical doctrine when required? Today we're going to be busting some myths. So, we're all military history geeks, of course, with a passion for learning about the First World War. But what if I told you you could actually refight that war using your own strategy and tactics? Sound good? Well, you're in luck, as today's sponsor is Supremacy 1914, a free online strategy game that allows you to choose a real country to lead throughout the conflict. You can fight hundreds of other players in games that can take weeks to complete. It's deep, thoughtful stuff. Build your army, declare war, forge alliances, and fight the war as you see fit. I think of it as brain training, and I like to see if I'm still capable of coming up with a coherent strategy and great tactics to try and win the war. Okay, here's the nitty gritty. You can play with the same account on both PC and mobile. Just click on the link in the description to get a gift of 15,000 gold marks and a month of premium subscription for free. That offer's only available for 30 days, so get stuck in now. Okay, thanks guys, let's get back to today's story. At the start of World War I, the British Army was small. Not as small as it is now, but tiny by European standards. They'd learned a lot from the Boer War of 1899 to 1902 fought in South Africa. As it says on the National Army Museum website, reforms in tactics, equipment and administration were introduced in the years after the conflict. These changes meant that when the army marched to war in 1914, it was the best equipped and trained force ever to leave British shores. Their musketry was outstanding. They could famously fire 15 aimed rounds a minute, inflicting terrible casualties on an attacking enemy.
These columns of Germans were coming up, you couldn't miss them. And this is why I think they thought we had machine guns, because the British Army was absolutely spot on with the rifle. It was.
At the Battle of Mons, Le Cateau and Ypres, we saw these incredible professional soldiers almost wiped out, fighting a modern industrial war that they just weren't prepared for. As the war of manoeuvre bogged down into a form of siege warfare, this trench warfare that we now associate with World War I, all of the combatants found themselves in new uncharted territory.
Come on, up you buggers!
Britain needed to raise a new army. One that would have to fight in an incredibly complex battle space. Lessons had to be learned quickly. Trench warfare, of course, wasn't new. It had been commonly used in sieges for centuries. But machine guns and artillery had changed the game. In 1915, much of the heavy lifting, much of the fighting, was carried by the territorial units of the British Army. For my American viewers, they would be the equivalent, I guess, of the National Guard. Now, I'm not going to stand here and claim that 1915 saw any fantastic British victories or a grand breakthrough, because we know it didn't. But the battles of Neuve-Chapelle and Loos did show us some signs of what could work. As Roger Dean says in his online paper, the relatively quick change and implementation of the new minor tactics nearly brought the British a major victory in the Battle of Loos in September 1915. The British infantry of Douglas Haig's corps suffered heavy losses, but succeeded in breaking the German lines. However, the failure to exploit this breakthrough was at the grand tactical level. The reserve of 2 infantry divisions were too far to the rear to be brought up in time to exploit the success. Some blame for the failure to exploit the breakthrough must fall on Haig, the commander of the corps. He committed all his divisions to the attack and kept nothing as a reserve. Haig had expected to draw upon the army's reserve if he was successful. And 1915 did see some small but important innovations being adopted by the British Expeditionary Force. The use of creeping barrage is one example. This is where artillery is used as like a shield to move forward in stages ahead of the advancing infantry. They began to better understand the use of heavy machine guns such as the Vickers and use them for indirect fire tasks. If you're not sure what that means, NATO describes indirect fire as fire delivered at a target which cannot be seen by the aimer. Aircraft began to be used in numbers. Gas was incorporated into the arsenal, as were grenades and Lewis guns. The Lewis gun was an air-cooled light machine gun that could be easily carried by infantrymen across the battlefield, providing an infantry section or platoon with added fire support. And platoons were now being seen as the most important tactical unit. The platoon, usually commanded by a second lieutenant, had a maximum strength of 44 other ranks. Platoons during the assault were allocated different roles. There were fighting platoons, support platoons and mopping up platoons. So things were beginning to change. Now, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, 1st of July 1916, is famously the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. Nearly 60,000 total casualties, of which about 20,000 were killed. Staggering, isn't it? But despite what many people might think, it wasn't an operation thrown together. There was a lot of serious planning and staff work that went into it. But the fact was the artillery hadn't achieved the impossible task allocated to it. The German wire hadn't been satisfactorily cut and too many rounds were duds that failed to explode. Those deep German bunkers and those well-entrenched machine gun positions hadn't been destroyed. There also wasn't enough cooperation between the infantry and the artillery. This meant that the fire plan wasn't flexible and couldn't be altered quickly to respond to events on the ground. As Paddy Griffith points out in this excellent book, Battle Tactics of the Western Front, highly recommended, the terrible error of the High Command was to continue the assault, even when it was clear it was a failure. They stubbornly hoped to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, when in reality a reassessment and a change of plans for a later attack would have been more beneficial. These were lessons learned the hard way and at a terrible cost in lives. But as the World War I veteran Charles Carrington wrote in his book Soldiers from Wars Returning, the British Army learnt its lessons the hard way. During the middle part of the Battle of the Somme and for the rest of the war, they were the best army in the field. So one positive thing that the British and Empire infantrymen gained on the Somme was experience, and bags of it. Those new army divisions were now veterans who understood the importance of planning and tactics. In February 1917, a very important manual was published which encapsulated much of those lessons that had been learned. It was called SS 143, Instructions for Training Platoons for Offensive Action. It's a very interesting document. Let's start off with what it says about weapon use. It says, the rifle and bayonet, being the most efficient offensive weapons of the soldier, are for assault, for repelling attack, or for obtaining superiority of fire. Every NCO and man in the platoon must be proficient in their use. The bomb is the second weapon of every NCO and man, and is used either for dislodging the enemy from behind cover or killing him below ground. The rifle bomb is the howitzer of the infantry and used to dislodge the enemy from behind cover and to obtain superiority of fire by driving him underground. The Lewis gun is the weapon of opportunity. Its chief uses are to kill the enemy above ground and to obtain superiority of fire. Its mobility and the small target it and its team present render it peculiarly suitable for working around an enemy's flank or for guarding one's own flank. Its stance on grenades is quite interesting because over the previous year or 18 months they had become a favourite weapon of the infantrymen.
Form a bomb block here!
But it was recognised by many officers that grenades actually would often slow down the assault because men would stand and trade grenades with the enemy instead of closing with them and attacking and using the rifle and bayonet to actually take the position. As one commander wrote, if you met a tiger coming down the street, would you shoot him or chuck a bomb at him? Paddy Griffith describes these new tactics outlined in the pamphlet as follows. The platoon attack was envisaged in two waves. The first wave would consist of two manoeuvre sections in line abreast. The rifles and advanced scouts to the left and the hand bombers to the right. Some 15 to 20 yards behind them would come the firepower elements, the rifle grenades to the left and the Lewis guns to the right. The platoon headquarters would be in the centre, somewhere between the two lines. Upon contact with an unsuppressed enemy, the firepower line would attempt to neutralise him, while the manoeuvre line tried to move forward, especially to a flank. Thus the enemy would be suppressed by fire from the front, while he was overrun by bayonets and bombs from the flank. So I'm sure many people who have served might know this as fix and flank, or now you know where it comes from. Here's a diagram of how they expected that to look in a trench-to-trench attack. And here's how they designed it for open warfare. The note at the bottom of the page says, correct use of scouts, Sections are under the hands of their commanders, a firing line has been built up, rifle bombs, Lewis gun fire and rifle fire are being used to obtain superiority over enemy fire. A flank is being turned. The idea of flexibility and initiative was also drilled into the officers and men. As early as May 1916, the Fourth Army's so-called Red Book said that soldiers and officers must always do their best to exercise initiative. Despite what many people might think now, throughout the war, officers, NCOs and men were constantly encouraged to think for themselves. The army also quickly began to understand and appreciate the use of infiltration tactics. Now, a Frenchman, Captain André Lafargue, is often credited as being the father of these infiltration tactics, and his work was very important. But parallel to that, the British were working on something very similar. A common saying became, when in doubt, go ahead. When uncertain, do that which will kill the most Germans. Do not fear an exposed flank. Okay, now let's fast forward a little. You're probably thinking, all right, smart Alec, well, what about the Battle of Passchendaele? What a disaster. Well, in actuality, Paddy Griffith points out that it probably represented the most sophisticated of all the BEF's attacks during the entire war. The biggest problem, though, was that there was a 6-week delay, and that meant the bad weather was incoming. As they attacked, the rain began. The choice of Gough as army commander was also a mistake. As it says on the Imperial War Museum website, the Third Battle of Ypres is perceived as muddy, bloody and futile. The early and latter stages of the battle largely conformed to this image, but the middle stages were actually very successful. In September, General Herbert Plumer replaced General Hubert Gough as commander. He introduced a new approach. Instead of attacking along a wide front and setting ambitious objectives deep inside the German defensive position, Plumer favoured a bite and hold strategy. It goes on to say, Plumer set limited objectives, making sure the attack was always within range of artillery support. Once they reached their objectives, troops dug in to prepare for counterattacks. Plumer's new approach was also helped by improved weather conditions in September. Better weather meant more artillery and aerial reconnaissance to support the attack. Although they continued to suffer heavy casualties, the Allies made significant progress at the Menin Road, Polygon Wood and Bruziende. But despite those successes, especially the one at Bruziende Ridge, it's fair to say that the battle should really have been called off once the mud became too bad. It was so thick that famously men drowned, and the shells would land and not explode. You can't fight battles in that environment. The attack literally became bogged down. And the battle led to a political crisis between the government back in the UK and the generals on the Western Front. Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, withheld troops from the Western Front, forced Haig to send others to Italy and demanded that the British take on extra miles of front from the French. This left the British Expeditionary Force massively overstretched and exposed. A situation that the Germans were able to leverage to great effect with their offensives in the spring of 1918. The German stormtroopers, often portrayed as these elite special forces type troops of World War I, were incredibly brave. But as Paddy Griffith says, they possessed no secret panacea with their talk of infiltration, merely the good fortune to encounter some incomplete British defensive positions in misty weather. He goes on to point out that the Germans were simply knocking down straw men using tactics that the British had implemented since the Somme. SS-143 was, in essence, a stormtrooper's handbook. And the value of those tactics were clearly seen in August 1918 when the British and Empire troops were finally able to counterattack and they swept all before them. The Germans had now shot their bolt and the bulk of their army had neither the tactics nor the training to maintain the offensive. The British, on the other hand, had become a modern army, with each platoon having an incredible amount of mechanical power at their fingertips and a deep understanding of the tactics needed to defeat the enemy. And still, individual units were working different ways to improve those tactics. The Canadians would often advance in what they called worms until they made contact with the enemy, when they would shake out into waves. This reminds me a little bit of the Napoleonic tactics of moving across the battlefield in column formation and then deploying into line to attack. Then there was blobs and diamond formations, which became the norm towards the end of the war. Here's an example of how diamond formations were used in the assault. Okay, so there are many reasons that the Central Powers were defeated in World War I, and I'm not claiming that it was all down to superior British infantry tactics. But they were important in breaking through those incredibly strong German defences on the Western Front. and helping to defeat such a powerful, though admittedly exhausted, enemy. The use of artillery continued to develop in conjunction with the changing infantry tactics until its power and effectiveness was almost incomprehensible in its scale. The British embraced tanks and aircraft. They created the Machine Gun Corps. This was an army of tactical innovators, lions at all levels who were willing to experiment. Even the high command, while far from perfect, were not the bumbling chateau generals of popular mythology. The Brits, Anzacs and Canadians did incredible work, finding ways to do what infantry has always and will always do best, closing with and killing the enemy. So just quickly, thanks again to today's sponsor, Supremacy 1914. Choose your own strategy, engage in epic battles and take over the world. If you click on the link in the description, you'll get 15,000 gold marks and 1 month of premium subscription for free. Now remember, that offer is only available for 30 days, so get stuck in now and prove you can do a better job than the likes of Haig and Ludendorff. If you've enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, give your comments below. I'll see you next week. And in the meantime, check out this video right here, which YouTube thinks you're gonna like.